Hey guys, how's it going? Jace Sensational here, welcome back to the channel. Today is just going to be a discussion-oriented video. This is going to be around the new game rule updates that we saw in the last patch. And I thought I wanted to make this video because I think that, at least after seeing, I've seen like a good amount of like opinions, on like Twitter and Reddit and things like that. That some opinions and thoughts I thought were a little bit unbased, um, and frankly, I disagree with, and I just want to give my own thoughts, and maybe we can have a discussion about it as well in the comments down below. But I just want to walk through some of the new changes, just in case you guys don't really know what's going on, because I think for newer people or for people less maybe involved or serious about the game, you might not understand what these changes mean and what their implications are and things like that. So I'm just going to highlight the changes. I'll try to have some clips that will show you guys what the changes look like in the game. And then I will talk about my own thoughts about them and maybe what I think are good and bad about them. So these are just the patch notes that were released the other week. I can leave them down below in the description as well if you guys are interested in just taking your time to read through them. But overall, there are two major changes to the overall rules and game mechanics of the game. The first one is the removal of the burst pass system, and then the second one is the merging of cast and play. And I'll explain both of them in detail, what has changed, and I'll try to show some clips comparing the differences, and then just talk a little bit more from there. But let's just start with burst passing. The main thing that has changed is that they have removed the ability, or at least the mechanic ability, to burst and pass to your opponent and then receiving initiative back after they have passed. So what happens now is you could, beginning this patch, if your opponent passes after playing only a burst or focus spell, you may now end the round. So what this means is that when you play a burst spell and then you pass, you no longer have the ability to, get to do something again if your opponent decides to pass back onto you. And I'll just quickly show this with a side-by-side comparison of what happens now when you burst pass. So here's just a quick example of how burst passing works in the past. So in this clip, I cast Star Shaping, which is a burst spell, and then I pass it back to my opponent. You notice that my opponent passes back to me, and then I am the one who has the ability to end the round. Here's what burst passing looks like now. I play Heaven's Line, which is a focus speed spell, and then I pass back to my opponent. But instead, my opponent now has the ability to end the round without giving it back to me. So now that I hope it's clear the differences between the burst pass, what was pre-patch and post-patch, I just want to talk about why I view this change as an overwhelmingly positive one. I think to some of the people who might see this as a negative change to the game, it's mostly because people view this as a sort of undermining of skill expression, given with the priority and pass mechanic within the game. The passing system is still definitely one of the most intricate and complicated aspects of Legends of Runeterra as a card game, and to the people who see the removal of burst pass as a way of taking away from that, I think is generally speaking quite incorrect. There's two different scenarios that come out of burst passing. So the first one is I burst pass by playing a focus or burst speed spell. So let's say I guiding touch my nexus and then I pass my opponent. My opponent passes back to me and then it's back to my initiative. I think this is what you'll see the most frequently, and this is probably the most annoying part to a lot of players. It's the sense that this burst pass mechanic is quite useless and doesn't advance the game state at all, besides just wasting each other's time. And this is one of the aspects where I love this change, because now you no longer have to sit there waiting, I burst pass and then my opponent passes back to me, and then I burst pass and then my opponent passes back to me. And now you're just going to cut down on the game time, make the game feel more fluid, and make the turns overall much faster. The second scenario where burst passing comes into play is if I play a burst speed spell. So I guiding touch my face, and now my opponent feels like they have to do something. And so they play like a 6-mana unit, and now I get to go in with my mana because my opponent has tapped under a certain threshold. And I think that to some players, they're like, oh no, now I can't burst pass and to bait my opponent into doing something, is I think just a totally incorrect statement, because I think that this portion of burst passing still always fundamentally exists. You can still burst pass in that way, as long as you are the person that's in the more advantageous spot, right? The idea of burst passing or just even open passing as a whole is the fact that you can pass at a point where your opponent feels like they need to do something. And you can still do that as long as you understand that you are in a position where it's fine if the turn ends, but your opponent is not in a fine position. The only difference now is that you cannot do that when you're behind, because now when you make a burst pass in a position where you cannot afford the round to end, then you get punished by that because now your opponent gets to end the round. And what I think comes out of this is a higher skill floor to the original burst pass mechanic, because now if you make a bad burst pass, you don't get the initiative back. Your opponent gets to punish you for making a bad play or a bad pass like that. And now this also increases the skill floor of being able to identify moments where if your opponent burst passes and I have the ability to end the round right then and there, I should take it. And then the second thing that this also affects is understanding when it is not okay for you to end the round. And I think these are two very key mechanics that still exist within this burst passing system that have only become more complex because of this change. Now, I think where one factor that I will submit to as a complaint towards the system is now that you can't burst pass when you're behind. And now, generally speaking, this doesn't really put you in an advantageous spot unless you're playing against an opponent that either takes the bait and plays into it, or your opponent passes or burst passes back in some way that they use a little bit too much mana and it gives you a slight edge in reactivity. So let's say like your opponent, you play like a 2-mana spell and then your opponent taps under Ruination, right? Or they tap under Vengeance and then you get to stick a unit. I think this is relatively niche because at a very high level, your opponent is expecting you to play into them, and so they'll just open pass back to you or something like that. So like that generally shouldn't change, but at lower levels, if you're behind, you can't really bait your opponent in the same way that you could have in the past. So just as a TLDR, I think this change overall is very fantastic. Overall increases the speed of the game, makes turns faster, cuts down on the unnecessary pass back and forth, and overall increases the skill floor of when to know to burst pass and when to know to end the round. Now, the second overall change to the game rules is this cast merge with play concept. This one's definitely a little bit more tricky to explain, so I'll try my best to make this as clear as I can. Essentially, there's a lot of cards, they say 61 here, that are affected in this way. Essentially, what happens is when a spell is committed to the stack, so when it is casted, and instead of when it is played is when it's resolved. So some cards that have been affected by this are cards like Heimer and Lux. So these are really easy examples to look at where they gain value after a spell resolves, right? So in the past, if you put a spell onto stack with Heimerdinger and the spell resolves, you'll generate a turret after that. Now, if your opponent is able to interact with you by like fizzling the spell or denying it, they deny you that turret that you gain from the spell. Same with Lux. If you cast a 6-mana spell from hand by putting it onto stack, even before it resolves, you will get the laser and your opponent can't really stop you from doing that. And now this goes to a bunch of different things, so that also involve a bunch of different champion level ups. So cards like Ezreal or Jace, which conditionally you need to cast 2 6-mana spells, or you need to target 6 enemies. Those will now also work as casts, so you only need to target them on stack, or you only need to put 2 6-mana spells onto stack, and then you'll level up your champions. And this has affected a bunch of different cards in different ways, such as Karma, Taric, and things like that. But there's too many cards there, so I won't really go into them. For the sake of this video, I will only bring up 4 major champions that I think are vastly affected by this and are the easiest ones to explain my points, those being Ezreal, Jace, Lux, and Heimer. So let's just jump into the game and I'll talk a little bit through it as I go. So I want to start by talking about the parts where I actually do like where this change is, and this is with champions like Heimer and Lux, which now gain their effect or gain their value, or I guess their upside, when you commit the spell onto stack. And so you'll gain the turret or you'll gain the laser when you commit the spell instead of when it resolves. And I actually quite like this change because this does make the game feel a little bit smoother. It's really cool to see you generate the turret as soon as you commit the spell, and same with the laser. It feels a lot smoother, the game feels more fluid, and it actually looks pretty cool, and I really enjoy these 2 champions. So I think it's totally fine that some outcome of this change is that champions like Heimerdinger and Lux got like a really huge buff. I think that is a perfectly positive example of how this has sort of affected the game. And, you know, while these 2 champions got buffed in a way that maybe some people disagree of how they work, it's still just fundamentally people would just accept that this is how Heimer and Lux work, and I think that's totally fine. So these champions got buffed. When you cast a spell, you will gain the turret, you will gain the laser, and now there's an upside to it even if Heimerdinger or Lux are removed, or if they get hushed or anything like that. So now you have some additional playability of these champions that makes a champion feel better about playing it, instead of, oh, I put like a really expensive spell on stack to get like a really big turret or to get a laser, but they got removed and now I don't gain the value there. So overall, I think to these 2 champions, this is a fantastic change. But now where I want to talk about maybe where I think that I dislike a little bit more of this change is with Ezreal and Jace, specifically their level up conditions. Both their level ups are very conditional based on the ability to not only to target enemies or to play 6 mana spells. And why I think that why I view this change as a negative one towards these champions specifically, and any sort of other champions that match this trope, is because these champions are game enders when they level up, right? A lot of decks that focus around a Jace deck or an Ezreal deck will build themselves in a way such that they are very easy to level up Ezreal with, or to level up Jace with. So you put in a lot of spells that target enemies, or you'll put in a lot of 6 mana plus spells. And one of the main focuses of the deck is to work towards their level ups. And then once you level up, you have a game-ending threat in your deck. The reason why I dislike this change to it is now you no longer have a way to interact with how these champions level up. I think one of the most intricate and interesting things about the game was that you could, say, glimpse the target that Ezreal was trying to target, or you could like single combat it so that the spells would fizzle, or like you would heal it so that Flock didn't activate, things like that. And you had very proactive and meaningful ways to slow down how Ezreal leveled up. And so you could interact with your opponent's game plan and slow down their overall level up and their overall win condition. Similar with Jace, if you like denied a 6 mana spell, or if you glimpsed a unit that was getting vengeanced, Jace wouldn't proc towards his level up condition, and then he would be maybe a whole turn later to level up and then get to his acceleration gate to push lethal. And I think that this comes to more of like a personal feeling of being able to interact with your opponent's game plan, because I think Riot could very simply balance Ezreal and Jace to say like, Ezreal, now I need to target like 8 enemies, or Jace, I need to play 3 6-cost spells. Just as an example, I don't know if those are particularly reasonable or not, but as sort of a compensation, they could just make it harder to level up. But even then, I still think it just gives a poor feeling, just like a personal inside feeling of not particularly being able to interact with how the deck fundamentally wants to level up the champions and work towards their overall level up condition. I really love having that interactability, and this is where I feel like a little of that is being taken away from this change, because I am unable to interact with my overall opponent's game plan, and this is why I had a lot of gripes with a deck like Mono Shrima, even though I thought the deck overall was a really cool concept and had a really sweet win condition. It was just because you couldn't interact with how their champions leveled up, and then once their champions leveled up, they flipped and then just won the game. Now, of course, that isn't to nearly a severe degree with cards like Ezreal or Jace, but the overall factor is, or the overall feeling is that I feel very helpless in being able to interact with how their champions level up, because I have no abilities to stop the level up progress after these spells go on stack. And I'll just show just a quick clip of a game that I had where this was in effect. So this is actually a perfect example where I really like this change and where I really don't. So my opponent is playing Jace Lux, and he plays an assembly line, which in turn levels his Lux as it's casted. So as he commits it onto stack, Lux gains his value. But what also happens is Jace also procs towards his level up condition. Even though I have this deny in hand and I do end up denying the assembly line, Jace still is able to progress towards his level up. I don't really mind that Lux is able to generate her laser because I think there's a really cool buff to it, but the overall feeling that I can't really interact with how Jace levels up is definitely where I feel a little bit disappointed in having less interactivity and agency over the game. And for the rest of the changes, a lot of them just stem really through Ezreal in particular, because I think that this change fundamentally impacts him a little bit differently than it impacts most other champions. And you can see in this clip where Ezreal can just simply burst you down with spells committed on stack. And now this doesn't really, this essentially doesn't change too much the game, because the outcome of something like this is generally pretty similar in like some niche scenario like this where you have like 6 target spells is relatively rare. Most of the time you just have like some mystic shots and burn that go face, whereas like, you know, you maybe could have prevented like 1 or 2 damage to it. But this whole concept of being able to overkill, gain, and being able to like just burst at speed shouldn't really exist in the game, and just feels particularly terrible because you just can't really interact with that, right? It's like if your opponent just like played 10 warning shots and just bursted you from 10. It's sort of like the same feeling where you see Ezreal come down and you feel like you have to just remove him on sight, otherwise you just get punished and just take a bunch of damage. And when on sight, I mean only on burst, right? Like it has to be burst, it has to be a hush, it has to be like a mini morph. Otherwise your opponent can just commit spells on the stack, and then you have no real way of preventing the damage once it gets put onto it. Going back to what I think is a little bit ironic, as I've shown through the changes where a lot of champions gain a little bit of value and access towards some abilities when a spell is committed onto stack with like a fast speed spell, is that they want to increase the overall utility of slow spells. This is definitely present through when you play like a slow spell and you no longer can stop Lux or Heimer from leveling or from gaining value off it, or a card like Jace from leveling off of it. But what's also sort of ironic about the statement of increasing the overall utility of slow spells is that a lot of fast spells gain value now at burst. So like Ezreal gains his damage when you commit, which is essentially burst, right? So as a card like Ezreal, really like essentially changes the speed of fast spells to burst in a sense, which means that slow spells or even other fast spells just have no way of interacting with Ezreal as a card. So now if you try to even like Vengeance Ezreal or even try to Ruinate Ezreal, a lot of his value just is gained off of the stack itself, and then, you know, a bit after the stack resolves. So the concept of making slow spells better is also a little bit ironic in comparison to making fast spells act as burst, which if you start just increasing the burst or increasing the speed of spells overall, then the slow spells still feel very out of place because cards like Ezreal can just burst out from there. I think another little bit of a change to the overall balance of champions is that not all champions benefit directly from this change. There are still a lot of champions out there that require certain effects to resolve in order to even gain procs towards level up. I think an easy example of this is Yasuo, where you need to stun 5 enemies. It can't be you need to target 5 enemies with stuns, right? So if your concussive palm gets denied, if your gravitum gets denied, if your, like, I don't know, Leona proc gets denied, or there's no unit left to stun, Yasuo isn't working towards his level up the same way that cards like Ezreal, the cards like Jace are. And I think that's just a disparity between some of the champ balance, even for simpler things like Garen, where it's I need to strike twice. If you target something with a single combat and the single combat is fizzled, then Garen doesn't gain any proc towards his level up condition, which, although is not necessarily a thing that we need to see happen, but it's just an interesting sort of balancing point and a little bit of a disparity and inconsistency between some champions as a whole, where some benefit from the fact that you only need to cast them instead of them resolving and having their effects go off, and others where you need them to resolve and go off and not just cast, which I think is, again, just a balancing issue. Overall, I'm not the most happy with this change. I think it does make certain aspects of the game more fluid, but overall there's going to be a lot of balancing that is needed to do within the game. And I'm a little bit scared of just how Riot can approach that. I have the highest hopes of them, and I hope that they're able to see this and really make a use out of it. But it is a factor that they need to approach, and it's something that we need to keep an overall eye of as we're going forward. So hopefully that hopefully I've explained, my explanations of the following changes are clear to anyone who just came onto this video just to understand some of the new changes. And hopefully my arguments are at least sound, but I'm happy to just talk through anyone else if you have any questions or comments within the comments down below, and we can start a discussion from there. But hope you guys found this a little bit interesting. And thank you guys so much for tuning in to today's video. So I'll catch you guys tomorrow for another one. Peace out, guys. Take care.